Sergeant Almeida, Dr. Helena continued, her voice sharp as steel. You are under arrest. Please hand over your weapon and your badge, and rest assured, your career in law enforcement ends here. And Mrs. Rosa, she turned to the elderly woman, who was looking at her with admiration, internal affairs will ensure you are fully compensated for all damages, and that justice is served. Almeida's world collapsed in an instant, shattering like broken glass. Dr. Helena's voice, once merely an annoyance, now echoed in his ears like a professional death sentence. Arrested. Him? Sergeant Almeida, with years of service, with a reputation, albeit built on a fragile foundation of intimidation and shortcuts, was being arrested by an internal affairs investigator who had appeared out of nowhere. The air seemed to thin, and a wave of heat rose up his neck, coloring his face a furious red. He couldn't believe it. His eyes, once full of arrogance, now widened in a mix of shock and outrage. He tried to speak, to stammer an objection, a protest, but the words caught in his throat, choked by humiliation. The hand that once wielded the badge with authority now trembled. The weapon in his holster seemed to weigh a ton, a symbol of power about to be ripped from him. The other officers, who until then had watched the scene with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, now exchanged glances, a heavy silence filling the space. No one dared to move, no one dared to intervene. The authority of internal affairs was unquestionable, and Dr. Helena, with her impeccable posture and steely gaze, radiated a force that made them instinctively recoil. Sergeant Almeida, Dr. Helena repeated, her patience exhausted. Don't make me repeat myself. Hand over your weapon and your badge. Now. With a slow, reluctant movement, as if every fiber of his being resisted, Almeida reached for his holster. His fingers hesitated for a moment, gripping the pistol's handle, a last vestige of control. But the investigator's fixed gaze gave him no choice. Slowly, he drew his weapon, the cold metal seeming to burn in his palm, and handed it to one of the internal affairs agents who approached. Then, with a heavy sigh, unclipping the badge from his belt, he handed it over as well. It was the end. He could feel it. Mrs. Rosa, who watched it all with tear-filled eyes, felt immense relief. Justice, which had seemed so distant moments before, now materialized before her. The old man, the white-haired gentleman who had been the target of Almeida's injustice, remained silent, observing the scene with an almost disturbing calm. His eyes, behind thin-rimmed glasses, seemed to register every detail, every nuance of the sergeant's downfall. Take Sergeant Almeida to the central precinct, Dr. Helena ordered, her voice returning to a professional and direct tone. He will be prosecuted for abuse of authority, planting false evidence and extortion, and I assure you, other charges will come to light. Two internal affairs agents approached Almeida, one on each side. He was handcuffed, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. The humiliation was complete, public, irreversible. As he was led to an unmarked car, Almeida cast one last look at Dr. Helena, a mix of hatred and disbelief. He couldn't accept that his career, his life, was being undone by a woman he barely knew, by an old man he had underestimated. The trip to the central precinct was a torment. In the back of the patrol car, with handcuffs tightening on his wrists, Almeida replayed the last few minutes, searching for a mistake, a loophole, anything that could reverse the situation. But there was nothing. He had been caught in the act. His own actions had condemned him. Rage bubbled in his chest, mixed with a growing fear. What would happen now? His family, his reputation, everything was ruined. Upon arriving at the precinct, the scene was one of controlled chaos. News of a sergeant's arrest for abuse of authority had already spread like wildfire. Curious and shocked eyes followed him as he was led through the corridors. The clinking of his handcuffs echoing with each step, he was taken to an interrogation room, cold and impersonal. The metal table, the hard chairs, the one-way mirror on the wall, everything seemed to conspire to heighten his sense of despair. As he waited, sitting alone, head bowed, Almeida tried to organize his thoughts, but it was useless. His mind was blank, save for one single, overwhelming certainty: he was finished. The door opened, and Dr. Helena entered, followed by one of her agents. But it wasn't just her. Behind her, with the same disturbing calm as before, stood the old man. The white-haired gentleman he had accused of drug trafficking, illegal possession of a weapon, of everything he could to incriminate him. Almeida raised his head, his eyes wide with surprise. What was he doing there? Why wasn't he being released? Dr. Helena sat opposite him, and the old man remained standing beside her, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Almeida. There was something different about him now, an aura of authority Almeida hadn't noticed before, obscured by his own arrogance. "Sergeant Almeida," Dr. Helena began, her voice serious, "we have some questions for you. But first, I think you should know who the person you tried to incriminate is." The old man stepped forward, and one of the Internal Affairs agents handed him a folder. He opened it, took out a document, and without a word, extended it to Almeida. The sergeant took the paper with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the lines, and his blood seemed to freeze in his veins. The name, the photo, the position. The old man was no mere senior citizen. He wasn't a nobody Almeida could crush. The document in his hands revealed the truth, a truth so shocking it made the air leave his lungs. There it was, in bold letters, the title he would never expect to see: Director General of the Federal Police, and the name, Dr. Augusto Mendez. Almeida felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The world spun. The irony was cruel, the punishment divine. He had planted false evidence in the car of the Director General of the Federal Police. He had tried to arrest the man standing right there in front of him during a surprise inspection, in plain clothes. Fear paralyzed him, a cold and absolute terror. He wasn't just arrested, he had committed professional suicide, and perhaps something far worse. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the frantic beat of Almeida's heart. The game was over, and he had lost overwhelmingly. The document in his hands seemed to burn, not with heat, but with a coldness that chilled his soul. Director General of the Federal Police. The words danced before his eyes, each letter a hammer striking his conscience. Dr. Augusto Mendez. The old man he had humiliated, blackmailed, tried to incriminate, was the highest authority of the institution he, Sergeant Almeida, had sworn to serve. The air thinned in Almeida's lungs. A high-pitched hum filled his ears, muffling the sound of his own heart beating erratically. He didn't feel the ground beneath his feet, only an abyssal void that swallowed him whole. The folder fell from his trembling hands, the muffled sound of paper against the cold interrogation room floor seeming like thunder in his private universe of despair. His eyes, once filled with an arrogant glint, were now wide, fixed on Dr. Mendez, who observed him with an almost supernatural calm. There was no explicit anger in the Director General's gaze, only a deep disappointment, a silent authority that was far more terrifying than any shout or threat. "Sergeant Almeida," Dr. Augusto Mendez's voice finally broke the silence, and each word resonated with the weight of a sentence. It wasn't a tone of accusation, but of confirmation, of a judge who had already weighed all the evidence. "I was on a surprise inspection in plain clothes to assess the integrity and efficiency of some of our units. Unfortunately, you provided me with a clear demonstration of the worst in our corporation." Almeida tried to speak, to stammer an excuse, a justification, but his throat was dry. The words stuck. He felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead, his shirt clinging to his back. The humiliation was palpable, the shame unbearable. He had boasted of his cunning, of his ability to manipulate the system, and now he stood there, unmasked, stripped bare, before the man who represented the very system he thought he had mastered. Dr. Helena, who until then had observed the scene with a professional and unperturbed demeanor, intervened, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "Sergeant Almeida, the document you just read is merely a formality. What matters are the facts. You, in full exercise of your duty, abused your authority, falsified evidence, attempted to extort an innocent citizen, and, to make matters worse, tried to incriminate the Director General of the Federal Police. Your actions are not just crimes, they are an affront to the institution, to the uniform you dishonored." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to penetrate Almeida's already shattered mind. "The charges against you are serious and multifaceted: abuse of authority, falsifying official documents, extortion, malfeasance, and now obstruction of justice and attempting to incriminate a federal authority. Each of these charges, by itself, would be enough to end your career. Together, they ensure you will face the most severe consequences of the law." Almeida shook his head, his eyes watery, trying to deny the reality that was imposing itself. "No, I didn't know. It was a mistake. I can explain." The words came out in a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper. He looked at Dr. Mendez, seeking a shred of clemency, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way out. But the Director General's face remained impassive, a wall of rectitude. "There is nothing to explain, Sergeant," Dr. Mendez replied, his voice calm but firm. "Your actions were deliberate. Mrs. Rosa was a victim of your greed and arrogance, and the fact that I was in plain clothes does not diminish the gravity of your intentions. On the contrary, it only reveals the depth of your corruption, which does not distinguish between an ordinary citizen and a high-ranking officer." Dr. Helena opened a folder in front of her, revealing a stack of documents. "We have Mrs. Rosa's testimonies, audio recordings you didn't know were being made, and the false evidence you planted in Dr. Mendez's vehicle. Everything is documented. Sergeant, there is no room for denial." Almeida's world didn't just collapse, it imploded. There was no escape, no negotiation. The web of lies and intimidation he had so carefully woven unraveled in an instant, revealing the fragility of his own existence. The image of his family, his home, everything he considered his own, began to fade, replaced by the cold, impersonal cell of a prison. He wasn't just an arrested officer, he was a destroyed man. "Sergeant Almeida," Dr. Helena continued, without a hint of emotion in her voice, "you will be formally charged. Your rights have already been read. You will have the right to an attorney, but I suggest he be a very good one, because what you did today will not be forgotten. The federal police does not tolerate corruption, and internal affairs will ensure that justice is served, no matter how high the rank or how convincing the lie." Almeida felt a chill run down his spine. The irony was cruel. He, who had always seen himself above the law, was now completely at its mercy. Fear, once a distant premonition, was now a cold, suffocating reality. The game was over, and all that remained was the tally of damages, and they would be incalculable. The silence in the interrogation room was an overwhelming weight, denser than any scream, colder than any cell. Almeida, once a confident predator, was now the prey, cornered, disarmed, his armor of arrogance shattered into 1,000 pieces. Dr. Helena's words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. Abuse of authority, falsifying official documents, extortion, malfeasance, obstruction of justice, and attempting to incriminate a federal authority. Each term was a nail hammered into the coffin of his career, his freedom, his life. His body trembled uncontrollably, a chill that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from the terror that froze his soul. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs seemed to refuse to cooperate, the air thin, heavy with the gravity of his situation. The image of his wife, his children, flashed in his mind, immediately followed by the certainty that all was irremediably lost. He had built a life on the quicksand of illegalities, and now the high tide of justice was dragging him into the abyss. Dr. Augusto Mendez, the old man he had so disdainfully underestimated, remained standing, his posture erect, unshakable. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, only a deep sadness, a disappointment that spoke louder than any reprimand. It was the disappointment of a leader who watched one of his own men fall, not from weakness, but from deliberate corruption. That look, devoid of anger, was infinitely more punitive than the shouts Almeida had expected. It was the look of someone who had already judged and found guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. "Sergeant Almeida," Dr. Helena's voice brought him back to the brutal reality. "Your rights have been read. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided." The words were mechanical, procedural, but for Almeida, each one was a blow. He, who had read these rights so many times to others, now heard them as a defendant. The irony was a sharp blade twisting in his open wound. An internal affairs agent, who had until then been in the background, approached with a clipboard. "Sergeant Almeida, please sign here, confirming that your rights have been read and understood." The pen in his hand seemed to weigh a ton. His fingers were so shaky he could barely hold it. He scrawled an illegible signature, a ghost of the man he once was. "You will be processed and taken into custody," Dr. Helena continued, her voice devoid of inflection, "and your weapon, badge, and any other departmental equipment will be seized immediately. Your preventive suspension is already in effect, and an administrative disciplinary process will be opened parallel to the criminal proceedings." With each word, Almeida's future unraveled. The suspension, the administrative process, the custody, it all added up to a single terrible conclusion. He was no longer a sergeant. He was no longer a police officer. He was a criminal, an outcast, a man who had betrayed the trust of his uniform and his nation. Dr. Mendez finally stepped forward, his voice calm but imbued with authority. "Sergeant, the federal police is an institution built on integrity and trust. What you did today is not just an individual failure, it is a stain on all of us. My presence here, in plain clothes, was to ensure that the system worked as it should, to protect the citizen. Unfortunately, you proved that there is still much work to be done, and you will be an example, Sergeant. An example that justice eventually reaches everyone, regardless of rank or position." Almeida raised his tear-filled eyes to the Director General. He wanted to beg, to plead for clemency, but the words refused to come out. The knot in his throat was an insurmountable wall. He had mocked the law, believed he was above it, and now the law crushed him with relentless force. "Take him," Dr. Helena instructed the agents, and the order sounded like the final toll of a funeral bell. Two agents approached, and Almeida felt the cold touch of the handcuffs again, this time tightening on his wrists with a sense of finality. He was lifted from the chair, his legs weak, almost giving way. As he was led out of the room, he cast one last look at Dr. Mendez, who still watched him with that expression of disappointment. The corridor seemed longer, the glances of his colleagues heavier. Whispers followed him, each one a stab at his already dying reputation. He, who once walked with his head held high, now shuffled, head bowed, shoulders slumped under the weight of his own ruin. The holding cell was cold, damp, and smelled of despair. The metal bars, the thin mattress, the stainless steel toilet. Everything was a cruel reminder of his new reality. He was stripped of his belongings, his identity, everything that defined him as Sergeant Almeida. Now, he was just a number, another detainee in the system he had sworn to uphold. Sitting on the cold floor, his back against the rough wall, Almeida closed his eyes. The chaos in his mind quieted for an instant, only to be replaced by a single, overwhelming image. The calm, disappointed face of Dr. Augusto Mendez. The old man he had tried to destroy had, in fact, destroyed him. And the irony, cruel and relentless, was the only company left to him in that darkness. The game was over, and all that remained was the tally of damages, and they would be incalculable. His life, as he knew it, had come to an end. The darkness of the cell was a mirror to the darkness that had settled in Almeida's soul. The smell of cheap disinfectant and despair permeated the air, a fragrance he never imagined associating with his own existence. The bare concrete walls seemed to close in on him, each crack a reminder of the fissures in his life that now opened into abysses. He sat on the cold floor, his back against the rough wall, knees bent, head in his hands. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of his own thoughts, which hammered his mind without mercy. He tried to reconstruct the last few days, the last few hours, searching for a turning point, a moment when he could have acted differently. But every path his mind traced led to the same precipice: greed, arrogance, the certainty of impunity that had blinded him. He had seen Mrs. Rosa as an easy target, another rung on his ladder of small crimes and major abuses. And the old man. The old man. The image of Dr. Mendez, calm, serene, with that look of disappointment, was the cruelest of all tortures. There was no anger, no shouts, only the cold, calculated disillusionment of a man who saw the institution he swore to protect being corrupted by one of his own. Almeida laughed, a dry, humorless laugh that was lost in the coldness of the cell. He, the clever sergeant, the man who bent the rules without breaking, the predator who always got away unscathed. He had underestimated the simplest of citizens, an elderly man with an old car and an harmless appearance. The irony was a slow poison, corroding his insides. He had planted the evidence with his own hands, certain he was sealing the fate of another victim. Little did he know he was digging his own grave. Dr. Helena's words echoed in his mind, each one a sledgehammer blow. Abuse of authority, falsifying official documents, extortion, malfeasance, obstruction of justice, and attempting to incriminate a federal authority. The list was endless, the weight overwhelming. He wasn't just an officer who made a mistake. He was a serial criminal, a betrayer of the uniform. The preventive suspension, the administrative process, the criminal proceedings, the cascade of consequences seemed to have no end. His career, his reputation, his freedom, everything slipped away like sand through his fingers. He thought of his wife, his children. What would they say? How would they react? The shame would be unbearable. The image of the hero father, the provider husband, would crumble to dust. He would lose them, lose everything. The house, the car, the comfortable life he had built on the foundations of his corruption. The future he had planned, with a generous retirement and peaceful days, was now a cruel mirage, replaced by the cold reality of a cell, a trial, a sentence. Outside, life went on. The sun rose, people came and went, but for Almeida, time had stopped. He was trapped in a limbo of regret and despair. What would he do? How would he face tomorrow? There were no answers, just emptiness. He tried to find a glimmer of hope, a sliver of light, but the darkness was absolute. The web he had woven for others had ensnared him, and now there was no escape. As Almeida drowned in his own misery in the interrogation room he had just left, Dr. Mendez and Dr. Helena remained. The folder of documents, once open, was now closed, sealing Almeida's fate. A sad case, Doctor, Dr. Mendez said, his voice still laden with deep melancholy. He picked up a glass of water and drank slowly, his eyes fixed on the wall, as if he could still see the sergeant's shadow there. That's why internal affairs is so vital. As much as we strive to select the best, the temptation of power and impunity can corrupt even the most promising. The cell door creaked open, and a guard, whom Almeida vaguely recognized as one of the rookies he used to intimidate, appeared. The guard's gaze was cold, devoid of any respect Almeida might once have demanded. "Sergeant, or rather, Almeida," the guard corrected himself with poorly disguised scorn. "Your lawyer is here, and your wife, but only one at a time. You have 10 minutes with each." The guard's voice was a brutal reminder of his new hierarchy, his new insignificance. The sergeant he once was had died. Now he was just Almeida, a detainee, a number. The news of his wife and lawyer brought no relief, only another wave of shame. How would he face her gaze? How would he explain the inexplicable? The humiliation was just beginning, and every minute spent within those cold walls was an eternity of torment. He rose, stumbling, feeling the weight of invisible handcuffs that now bound not only his wrists, but his soul. The walk to the visiting room would be the first of many painful journeys in his new reality. The cell door, which once seemed a gateway to Almeida's personal hell, now opened to a new layer of torment. Each step toward the visiting room was a walk over broken glass, each creak of the floor a reminder of his downfall. He felt the gazes of the other guards, the same ones who once revered or feared him, now laden with contempt or, worse, with icy indifference. The air of the precinct, once his domain, now suffocated him with the stench of his own ruin. He entered the visiting room, a sterile space with a metal table and 2 chairs. Sitting with a folder on his lap was Dr. Ricardo, his lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired expression whom Almeida had known for years. But the look Dr. Ricardo gave him was not one of camaraderie, but of deep consternation. "Almeida," the lawyer began, his voice low and grave without preamble, "the situation is very, very serious." Almeida tried to compose himself, to straighten his posture, but the dignity he once possessed had unraveled. "How serious, Doctor? It's a misunderstanding. I can explain." Dr. Ricardo raised a hand, interrupting him. "There are no misunderstandings here, Almeida. There is evidence, and there is the testimony of the Director General of the Federal Police. He was in plain clothes, conducting a surprise inspection. You approached him, planted false evidence in his car, and tried to extort him. All of it was recorded. And Mrs. Rosa, the elderly woman you previously tried to incriminate, also had recordings of your interactions. The case is solid. It's a disaster." The lawyer's words hammered into his skull, recorded, all recorded. The certainty of impunity that drove him had been his own trap. He felt a knot in his throat, bile rising. But I'm a police officer. I have a history of service. It can't be that serious, can it?" Dr. Ricardo sighed, closing the folder with a dry snap that echoed in the room. "Almeida, you are not just a police officer. You are an officer who committed abuse of authority, falsifying official documents, extortion, malfeasance, obstruction of justice, and attempting to incriminate a federal authority. And what's worse, you did it to the Director General of the institution you swore to protect. This is not a mistake, it's a betrayal. And the message the federal police wants to send is clear: zero tolerance. They want to make an example of me, Almeida murmured, his voice hoarse. Exactly, the lawyer confirmed without mincing words. There is no room for plea bargaining at this moment. The prosecution will seek the maximum penalty for each of the crimes. Your service record, which you mentioned, will be used against you to demonstrate the gravity of the breach of trust. and Internal Affairs already has an administrative process open that will invariably result in your expulsion from the force. Almeida's head spun. Expulsion. Prison. The life he knew shattered into pieces. And my assets, my retirement. They will be frozen, Almeida. There's an investigation into illicit enrichment. Previous complaints, which previously lacked sufficient evidence, will now be re-examined under a microscope. Your retirement, forget it. You will lose everything. Almeida's world collapsed completely. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a man without a future, without a name, without anything. Silence settled heavy as the lawyer watched him with a mix of pity and resignation. "I will do what I can, Doctor," Ricardo finally said, his voice softer but without hope. "But prepare yourself, Almeida. The battle will be long and the outcome almost certain. You are in an unprecedented situation." 10 minutes. Time ran out. The guard reappeared and Almeida was led back to the corridor to await the next visit. His wife. The humiliation he felt now was even deeper, more personal. When she entered the room, the shock on her face was palpable. Anna, his wife, the woman with whom he had built a life, now looked at him as if he were a stranger, a monster. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and the anger mixed with pain was evident in every feature of her face. "Almeida," she whispered, her voice choked. There was no affection, only the coldness of a name uttered out of obligation. He tried to approach her, but she recoiled, as if he were contagious. "Anna, my love, I can explain. It was a mistake, I swear." "A mistake!" she exploded, tears finally streaming uncontrollably. "A mistake, Almeida. You destroyed everything, our life, our children's future. The shame you've brought upon us is unbearable. I heard it on TV, Almeida, the Director General of the Federal Police. You're a madman, a criminal." Her words were like knives, each one piercing the little resistance he had left. He had never seen her so furious, so disillusioned. The image of the hero father, the provider husband, crumbled before his very eyes, crushed by the brutal reality of his actions. "I thought I was doing what was best for us," he tried to argue, his voice choked. "To have more, to give more." "To have more?" she screamed, slamming her hand on the table. "At the cost of honesty? At the cost of our reputation? Our children will be mocked at school. I won't be able to go out in public. You've condemned us, Almeida, condemned all of us." He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. The pain in her voice was an echo of the pain he had inflicted on so many others, but which now turned against him, multiplied. "I don't know how we'll go on, Almeida," she said, her voice now broken, filled with a deep sadness that was even more devastating than her anger. "I don't know if there's an us after this. I don't recognize you anymore. The man I loved, he wouldn't do this." The guard reappeared. Time once again expired. Anna stood up without looking back, without a word of farewell. The door closed behind her, and Almeida was left alone, the void left by her departure heavier than any handcuff. He had lost everything, and now he realized he had lost himself. The darkness of the cell awaited him, and with it, the certainty of a solitude that would be his only companion from then on. The game was over, and the price of defeat was total annihilation. The creak of the cell door, closing with a dull thud, was the final sound that sealed Almeida's fate. The void Anna left was not just the physical absence of his wife. It was the absence of hope, of forgiveness, of any trace of a future he once imagined. He was alone, more than ever, and the darkness of the cell seemed to swallow him whole, not only with its physical gloom, but with the abyssal darkness of his own soul. Anna's words echoed in his mind like a chorus of condemnation. "You destroyed everything. Our children will be mocked at school. You condemned us, Almeida." Each phrase was a blow, and he felt the weight of each one, not in his body, but in his spirit. The man he thought he was, the respected or feared officer, the provider, the father, the husband, everything disintegrated into dust. He was no longer a sergeant, he was an outcast, a criminal, a man without a name, without honor, without anything. He slumped onto the concrete bench, the cold penetrating his clothes and skin. But the cold in his heart was far more intense. The invisible handcuffs that once bound his soul now materialized in the brutal reality of his new existence. Total annihilation. It wasn't just a phrase, it was his new truth. Hours dragged on, or perhaps minutes. Almeida no longer distinguished. Time had lost its meaning. The smell of mold and cheap disinfectant in the cell, once just an annoyance, was now the scent of his ruin. He tried to close his eyes, but the images refused to disappear. The calm, disappointed face of the Director General, the contemptuous gaze of the guard who led him, the pain and anger in Anna's eyes. Suddenly, the door creaked again. Almeida flinched, expecting another visit, another dose of humiliation. But it wasn't a visit. It was an internal affairs officer, accompanied by two guards he had never seen before, all with impenetrable expressions. "Almeida, prepare yourself," the officer said in a monotone, emotionless voice. "You will be transferred to a federal detention unit. Your administrative process has already begun, and as you must know, your expulsion is imminent. Your assets are frozen, and the investigation into illicit enrichment is ongoing. You no longer have access to any privileges or benefits of the force." The words were expected, but the formality and coldness with which they were uttered were a shock. It was the officialization of his professional death, the signing of his obituary as a police officer. He was handcuffed again, this time more tightly, and led out of the cell. Each step was a farewell. Farewell to the precinct that was his stage, farewell to the uniform that was his shield, farewell to the life he knew. In the corridor, he noticed glances. They were not the glances from before, of respect or fear. They were glances of morbid curiosity, of repulsion, and in some cases of poorly disguised satisfaction. The same colleagues he had stepped on, the same rookies he had intimidated, now saw him as a trophy, proof that justice sometimes reached even the untouchables. Outside, a federal police vehicle, different from those he used to drive, awaited. The sirens were off, but its presence was imposing. He was pushed into the back seat between the two agents, and the doors closed with a metallic click that seemed to seal his coffin. The urban landscape passed by the window, but he didn't see it. His mind was trapped in a labyrinth of regret and despair. Meanwhile, in an immaculate office at Federal Police Headquarters, Director General Dr. Mendes and Dr. Helena reviewed the final details of the press release. News of a sergeant's arrest for planting false evidence in the car of the Director General himself, who was in plain clothes, was about to explode. "We need to be transparent, Dr. Helena," Dr. Mendes stated, his voice grave. "The institution needs to show that it does not condone misconduct regardless of rank or length of service. This case, however painful, is an opportunity to reaffirm our values." "I agree, Director," she replied, adjusting her glasses. "The statement will emphasize the gravity of the crimes, the swiftness of the investigation, and the federal police's zero-tolerance policy. We will also make sure to mention the cooperation of Mrs. Rosa, the elderly woman Almeida previously tried to incriminate. This will show that the common citizen's complaint is vital and will be taken seriously." Dr. Mendes nodded, a heavy sigh escaping him. "It's a stain, no doubt, but a stain we are cleaning with determination. Let it serve as a lesson to all. The uniform is a symbol of protection and justice, not of impunity." Back in the patrol car, Almeida felt the movement of the vehicle. The hum of the engine. He was being taken to an unknown place, to a life he didn't want, to a future he couldn't imagine. Shame was a heavy cloak, and solitude a constant companion. He had played the game of life with the wrong rules, and now he was paying the highest price. Total annihilation was not just the end of his career, it was the end of his identity, his dignity, of everything he once thought he was. The road ahead was long and dark, and he knew there would be no turning back. The monotonous hum of the federal vehicle's engine was the soundtrack to his descent into hell. Almeida was huddled in the back seat, handcuffs tightening on his wrists. The smell of new leather and disinfectant brutally contrasting with the odor of mold and despair that permeated his clothes. Each kilometer traveled was another mile further from the life he knew, from the identity he had built and destroyed. The urban landscape, once a familiar sight, now passed as indifferent blurs, a world he observed from behind an invisible cage. The arrival at the federal detention unit was as impersonal as it was brutal. A massive iron gate opened with an electronic screech, revealing a complex of concrete and barbed wire. There was none of the familiar, albeit tense atmosphere of the local precinct. Here everything was cold, efficient, and designed to break any last vestige of individuality. He was led through sterile corridors, under the watchful eyes of guards with impassive faces, each one a silent reminder of his new status. No longer a police officer, but a number, a prisoner. The intake process was humiliating. His clothes were confiscated, replaced by a uniform of rough, faded fabric. His few personal belongings, his watch, his wallet with the faded photo of Anna and the children, were catalogued and stored, perhaps never to be seen again. He was searched, every inch of his body exposed to the clinical indifference of the agents. His dignity, already in tatters, was completely pulverized. He was no longer Sergeant Almeida, the man who commanded respect or fear. He was just a detainee, stripped of everything, including his name. Meanwhile, the world outside exploded. At Federal Police Headquarters, Dr. Mendez and Dr. Helena were finishing the press conference. Cameras flashed incessantly, microphones extended like a forest of slot machines, eager for every word. Dr. Mendez, with his imposing posture and grave voice, spared no details. The Federal Police, in a joint operation with Internal Affairs, arrested Sergeant Almeida of the Civil Police for planting false evidence in the vehicle of the Director General himself, who was on a surprise inspection in plain clothes. The press room erupted in a buzz. The news was shocking, surreal. A police officer daring to incriminate the head of the Federal Police? The irony was stark, the audacity unbelievable. Dr. Helena, with her surgical precision, detailed the investigation, the previous complaints against Almeida, the cooperation of Mrs. Rosa, the elderly woman he had tried to incriminate before. "This case," she declared, "is a testament that justice, however long it may take, always prevails, and that the Federal Police will not tolerate misconduct, regardless of rank." Newspaper headlines and TV news reports filled with the story. Corrupt sergeant tries to incriminate federal chief. The fall of Almeida, the officer who became a criminal. Zero tolerance. Federal police shows strength against internal corruption. Almeida's image, once an anonymous face in the police machine, was now plastered everywhere, synonymous with shame and betrayal. The entire country watched his public annihilation. In the cold, dark cell, Almeida didn't see the news, but he felt their weight. The guards, once merely impassive, now looked at him with a mix of contempt and curiosity. He was the spectacle, the living example of what happened when one crossed the line. He tried to eat the bland food served to him, but his stomach churned. Anna's words, the lawyer's accusations, the Director General's disappointment, everything mingled in a deafening chorus in his mind. He remembered the small corruptions, the favors he demanded, the intimidations he carried out. Small deviations, he thought, to improve his life, to give more to his family. But each of these small deviations was a step on the ladder that led him to this abyss. The irony was bitter. He, who planted evidence, was now the living proof of a system's failure, the personification of the corruption he swore to combat. Dr. Mendes in his office watched the news with a serious expression. The stain was there, but the cleaning was being done for all to see. "Let it serve as a lesson," he murmured to himself, as the image of a handcuffed Almeida passed across the screen. The uniform, a symbol of protection, had been desecrated, but the institution, he knew, was greater than any individual. Back in the cell, Almeida huddled in the corner, the cold concrete penetrating his bones. The darkness was absolute, not just the absence of light, but the absence of hope. He had lost everything, his career, his family, his dignity. And now, with each passing minute, he lost a little more of himself. Total annihilation was not just a threat, it was a reality that swallowed him whole, a destiny sealed by the creak of the cell door and the echo of condemning words that resonated in his mind. The road ahead was long, dark, and without any glimmer of redemption. The darkness of the federal cell was not just the absence of light. It was a darkness that seemed to swallow sound, time, and above all, hope. Almeida huddled on the metal bunk, the thin, rough mattress offering little comfort against the penetrating cold emanating from the concrete walls. The smell was a mixture of strong disinfectant, other people's sweat, and a persistent mold that seemed to permeate everything, including his soul. He tried to sleep, but sleep was a luxury his tormented mind refused to grant. Every distant noise, the creak of a gate, the echo of footsteps in the corridor, the muffled murmur of voices, was a reminder of his new reality, of his powerlessness. He found himself reliving every moment of that fateful day, the arrogance in approaching the old man, the perverse satisfaction in planting the drugs, the shock upon discovering Dr. Mendes's true identity. Memory was a relentless executioner, lashing him with regret and impotent rage. Rage at himself for having been so blind, so stupid. Rage at the system he believed he dominated, but which now crushed him without mercy. In the oppressive silence, Anna's words echoed in his mind. The lawyer's accusations, the icy disappointment in the Director General's gaze. He had built his life on a web of small lies and major abuses, convinced he was untouchable, above the rules. Now the web unraveled, and he fell into a bottomless abyss. The uniform, which was once his shield and his weapon, had become the uniform of his shame, indelibly stained. Outside, the world continued its relentless spin, but for Almeida it had stopped. News of the press conference, though he hadn't seen it, was felt as shockwaves that passed through the cell walls. He imagined the headlines, the shocked faces, the comments of disdain. His name, once associated with a certain authority, was now synonymous with corruption, with betrayal. The public annihilation was as real as the physical, stripping him of his reputation, his dignity, of any trace of respect he might once have commanded. He thought of his children. How would they react? How would they go to school carrying the weight of a criminal father's name? Anna's pain, the shame he imposed on them, was an even greater burden than his own handcuffs. He had promised a better life, security, comfort. Instead, he was delivering a legacy of disgrace. The irony was cruel. He, who sought to protect his family through illicit means, now exposed them to the greatest of vulnerabilities. Morning arrived, bringing with it a weak, grey light that barely penetrated the small barred window. Breakfast, a bowl of bland porridge, and a cup of something that resembled coffee, was left in his cell by a guard who avoided eye contact. The indifference was sharper than any insult. He was no longer a colleague, not even an adversary to be feared. He was just a detainee, another in the long line of failures. Meanwhile, in his office, Dr. Mendes reviewed the impact reports from the press conference. The repercussions were massive, exactly as planned. The message of zero tolerance had been delivered with crystal clarity. The image of the federal police, though momentarily shaken by the revelation of such a grave deviation, was being rebuilt on the pillars of transparency and relentless justice. Director, complaints against Almeida are pouring in from all sides, Dr. Helena informed, with a stack of documents in hand. Cases of extortion, planting evidence, abuse of authority. The list is extensive. It seems his downfall opened the floodgates. Dr. Mendes nodded, his eyes fixed on the TV screen broadcasting news about the case. That's what happens when fear is replaced by hope, Dr. Helena. Victims, once silenced by power, now find their voice. Let each of these complaints be investigated with the utmost rigor. Let it serve as an example to all who think the uniform is a free pass for impunity. He knew the battle didn't end with Almeida's arrest. It was just the beginning of a long process of cleansing, of restoring trust. But the initial message had been sent, strong and clear. No one was above the law, especially those who swore to uphold it. Back in the cell, Almeida tried to find a shred of strength, a remnant of his old self-confidence, but there was nothing. With each breath, the air seemed heavier, the reality more crushing. He was trapped not only by iron bars, but by the webs of his own actions. Total annihilation was not a single event, but a continuous process, a slow and painful erosion of everything he once was. The road ahead was long and dark, and he knew that for him there would be no light at the end of the tunnel, only the echo of his own mistakes, reverberating in eternal darkness. On the afternoon of the second day of his detention, his cell door creaked open, and a guard announced his lawyer's visit. Almeida felt a flicker of something that could have been hope, but it quickly transformed into a grim premonition. The lawyer, Dr. Ricardo, entered the visiting room, a sterile cubicle with a metal table and 2 chairs. His face was pale and tired, and his eyes avoided Almeida's. "Sergeant," he began, his voice low and laden with resignation, "the situation is much worse than we imagined." Almeida felt a chill down his spine. "Worse how?" he managed to ask, his throat dry. Dr. Ricardo sighed, opening a folder full of papers. "Since the press conference, complaints haven't stopped pouring in. Internal Affairs and the Federal Police have opened a task force. We have over 20 new cases, Sergeant. Extortion, abuse of authority, planting evidence on other occasions, threats. The list is frightening. It seems your arrest was the trigger for all the victims who were previously afraid to speak." Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the last fragments of his defense. 20 new cases. The number echoed in his mind, exponentially multiplying the gravity of his situation. He was no longer just the officer who tried to incriminate the Director General. He was a serial criminal, a predator operating under the cloak of the law. "And Anna, the children?" Almeida asked, his voice almost a whisper. Dr. Ricardo slowly shook his head. "Anna is devastated. She asked me to tell you she won't be visiting you anymore. She and the children are suffering threats and humiliations. She's considering filing for divorce and moving to another city to protect them. Her and your children's image is being associated with yours everywhere." The news of the imminent divorce and the shame he had brought upon his family was the final blow. Those he swore to protect, he now destroyed. Those he tried to support with favors, he now dragged through the mud. The annihilation was not just his, it was his family's too. He had lost everything, and now he was losing them. The air in the small room grew thin, and Almeida felt the weight of the world collapse upon him. Hope, however faint, completely evaporated. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The web of lies he had woven had transformed into a shroud, and he was irremediably trapped within it. The road ahead was long, dark, and now he knew he would walk it alone. With the echo of his own mistakes and the deafening silence of a family he had destroyed, those words from Dr. Ricardo were not just a blow. They were the final annihilation, an earthquake that toppled the last pillars of his existence. The air in the small visiting room became dense, almost palpable, and Almeida felt himself drowning in an ocean of despair. Ana, the children, the family he, in his distorted logic, believed he was protecting, he had now destroyed. The shame he imposed on them was a burden heavier than any handcuff, a scar that would never heal. He tried to speak, but no voice came. His throat was dry, his lips sealed. Dr. Ricardo, with a look of pity Almeida couldn't bear, continued, filling the silence with the harshness of reality. The legal situation, Sergeant, is untenable. With over 20 complaints and the Internal Affairs and Federal Police Task Force working tirelessly, the defense strategy we had, it simply no longer exists. Each testimony is corroborated. Every planted piece of evidence is being unearthed. They have everything, and the media will give you no quarter. Almeida's mind spun in a whirlwind. 20 cases. 20 lives he had touched with his corruption, his arrogance, his abuse of power. Each name, each face he barely remembered, now materialized as a ghost, haunting him, demanding justice. He was no longer the untouchable sergeant, the man who dictated the rules. He was a defendant, a criminal, and the weight of the law, which he had so disrespected, now fell upon him with overwhelming force. The lawyer closed the folder with a heavy sigh. "There's nothing more to be done here, Sergeant. I will do my best, but prepare for the worst. The sentence will be severe. And as for your family, Ana is unyielding. She needs to protect the children. They are being bullied at school. The house is being vandalized with graffiti. She sees no other way out but to start over far from all this." Almeida merely nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. The pain was so profound it had become numbness. He had lost everything: his career, his reputation, his freedom, and now the only thing left of his personal life. The irony was cruel. He, who sought to protect his family through illicit means, now exposed them to the greatest of vulnerabilities, to public shame and disintegration. He had promised a better life, security, comfort. Instead, he was delivering a legacy of disgrace. As Dr. Ricardo rose to leave, Almeida felt an icy void, a solitude that seemed to suck all the light from the room. He was alone, completely. The web of lies he had woven had transformed into a shroud, and he was irremediably trapped within it. The road ahead was long, dark, and now he knew he would walk it alone, with the echo of his own mistakes and the deafening silence of a family he had destroyed. Far from the darkness of Almeida's cell, in the heart of the Federal Police, Dr. Mendez and Dr. Helena worked tirelessly. The press conference had been just the first step. The wave of complaints that followed was proof that the strategy was working. Fear was being replaced by hope, and voices silenced for years finally found an echo. "Director, the task force is progressing rapidly," Dr. Helena reported, her eyes gleaming with a mix of tiredness and satisfaction. "It's not just Almeida. The investigations are revealing a network of complicity and omission that extends across several departments. It seems his downfall opened a Pandora's box, exposing others who operated under the same aegis of impunity." Dr. Mendez watched the screen in his office, where complex graphs and data mapped the connections and patterns of corruption. "It was what we expected, Dr. Helena. Rot is rarely an isolated phenomenon. Our goal is not just to punish Almeida, but to eradicate this mentality that the uniform is a free pass. We need to restore public trust, and that will only be done with a deep and transparent cleansing. Each day, new names emerged, new evidence was collected. The process was meticulous, painful, but necessary. The image of the federal police, though temporarily shaken, was being rebuilt on pillars of integrity and justice. The message was clear. No one was above the law, especially those who swore to uphold it. Dr. Mendez knew the battle was long, but the determination in his eyes was unshakable. He was forging a new era for the institution, an era where honor and duty would prevail over corruption and abuse. For Almeida, however, the era of his life had come to an abrupt end. In the cell, reality solidified with each passing minute. He had gambled everything on his invulnerability, on his ability to manipulate the system, and he had lost. Total annihilation was not a single event, but a continuous process, a slow and painful erosion of everything he once was. The road ahead was long and dark, and he knew that for him there would be no light at the end of the tunnel. Only the echo of his own mistakes, reverberating in eternal darkness, and the deafening silence of the family he had destroyed. The future was an abyss, and he fell without hope of redemption. The silence that followed Dr. Ricardo's departure was not merely the absence of sound. It was a vacuum, a black hole that swallowed the last spark of his existence. Almeida sat there on the metal chair, but his mind, his spirit, everything that defined him had disintegrated. Ana, the children, their image distorted by the pain and shame he had inflicted upon them, was a torment crueler than any interrogation. He had promised a shield, but had delivered a sword that wounded them deeply. Days dragged on, indistinct in the cold cell. The monotonous and brutal prison routine was the new rhythm of his life. But the real blow came with the formalization of the charges. In a preliminary hearing, swift and devoid of any hope, Almeida heard the list of crimes weighing upon him. It was no longer just the incident with the Director General. There were 20, now 25 cases of extortion, abuse of authority, planted evidence, ruined lives. Each item read by the prosecutor was a nail in his coffin, sealing his fate with the relentless coldness of the law. Dr. Ricardo, by his side, seemed like a ghost, his voice a whisper of resignation as he tried to argue against the mountain of evidence. But there was no defense. Witnesses, once intimidated, now came forward with renewed courage, their testimonies corroborated by documents, recordings, and Almeida's own implicit confession, who, in his desperation, had left traces everywhere. The media, hungry for justice and scandal, transformed each new revelation into sensational headlines, painting Almeida as the archetype of the corrupt police officer, a public enemy. His image, once one of authority, was now that of an outcast, a symbol of the rot that society yearned to eradicate. As Almeida languished in his cell, the outside world spun at a dizzying speed, driven by the revelation of his downfall. Director General Mendez's press conference had been the fuse, but the Internal Affairs and Federal Police Task Force was the true engine of an unprecedented cleanup. Dr. Helena, tireless, coordinated the teams who worked day and night scouring archives, interviewing dozens of victims and witnesses, unraveling a web of corruption that extended far beyond Almeida. "Director, more names emerge every day," Dr. Helena reported to Mendez, her eyes red with fatigue, but with an iron determination. "It's not just a matter of corrupt individuals. It's a system that allowed this to happen. We have indications of omission, cover-ups, of a culture of impunity that has taken root in some sectors." Mendez listened, his face grave. He knew the battle was much larger than the arrest of a single sergeant. It was a war for the soul of the institution. With each new name revealed, with each officer detained, the pain was palpable. They were colleagues, some with years of service, who had strayed from the path. But the need to restore public trust was imperative. "We need to be relentless, Doctor." "Elena," Mendez affirmed, his voice calm but imbued with authority. "We cannot leave any stone unturned. Every link in this chain of corruption must be broken. And more importantly, we need to implement mechanisms that prevent this from happening again. New guidelines, reinforced training, secure reporting channels. Transparency will be our greatest weapon." The wave of arrests and suspensions spread through the news, shocking the nation. Officers of different ranks, some with untouchable reputations, were led away in handcuffs, their faces displaying a mix of shock and resignation. The Pandora's box Almeida had opened revealed not only his own crimes, but the complicity and negligence of many others. The federal police, under Mendez's leadership, was undergoing a painful but necessary process of catharsis. Far from the bars that imprisoned Almeida, the machinery of justice, now under the firm baton of Director General Mendez, operated with relentless efficiency. Each day, the hope for a more just and integral institution grew, even if the path was long and full of obstacles. Public trust, shaken by years of disillusionment, began to be slowly rebuilt, brick by brick, with every transparent action and every corrupt individual exposed. For Almeida, the future was an endless tunnel, a continuous descent into the depths of his own ruin. Total annihilation was not a single event, but a continuous process, a slow and painful erosion of everything he once was. The road ahead was long and dark, and he knew that for him there would be no light at the end of the tunnel, only the echo of his own mistakes, reverberating in eternal darkness, and the deafening silence of the family he had destroyed. For the institution he had stained, however, the path was arduous, but the promise of a new dawn began to shine, guided by Mendez's determination to forge an era of honor and duty. Silence was his new companion, a heavy cloak woven with the threads of regret and the echoes of an irremediably shattered life. In the cold cell, days dragged on, indistinct, marked only by the clang of doors and insipid meals. Almeida, the sergeant who once commanded fear and respect, was now an empty shell, his gaze lost, his spirit crushed. The images of Ana and his children, once a distorted motivation, haunted him incessantly, not as the promise of a better future, but as the cruelest of accusations. He had promised a shield, but had delivered a sword that wounded them deeply, plunging them into an abyss of shame and ostracism that no poverty could ever have created. The legal process advanced, relentless and devoid of mercy. Each hearing was a new blow, each victim's testimony a stab. The 25 charges, now formalized, rose like a monument to his depravity. Extortion, abuse of authority, fabricated evidence, ruined lives. The list was an epitaph for his career, for his freedom, for his very identity. Dr. Ricardo, his lawyer, no longer tried to disguise his resignation. His words were mere formalities, a funeral ritual before the burial. "Sergeant, the prosecution is seeking the maximum penalty for each of the crimes. Recidivism, the gravity of the acts, the position of trust. There are no mitigating circumstances." Almeida listened, but the words seemed distant, muffled by a constant hum in his ears. It was the sound of his world collapsing, of the sandcastle he had built with lies and intimidation, being swept away by the relentless tide of justice. He had believed himself untouchable, above the rules, a master of the game. But the game had turned, and he was now the sacrificed piece, worthless, purposeless. The irony was a slow poison, corroding him from within. He who had planted evidence to incriminate others was now crushed by the mountain of evidence he himself, in his arrogance, had left behind. There was no redemption, only the certainty of severe punishment, a life behind bars where his only companion would be the incessant echo of his own mistakes. Darkness was no longer a threat. It was his new reality, a bottomless abyss, without light, without hope. Far from the cold walls of Almeida's cell, the light of hope, though faint, began to break through the darkness that had long hovered over the federal police. Dr. Mendez and Dr. Helena, tireless, led the task force that had become a tsunami of cleansing. The Pandora's box, opened by the incident with the Director General in plain clothes, had revealed a network of corruption vaster and deeper than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just Almeida. It was a complex web of connivance, omission, and abuse that extended across various ranks and departments, rooted in a culture of impunity. "Director, arrests continue," Dr. Helena reported, her eyes bloodshot with fatigue, but with renewed energy. "We have 3 more high-ranking officers detained this morning. The evidence is irrefutable: extortion, embezzlement, cover-ups of crimes. The list is shocking. But most importantly, Director, the complaints keep coming. The public is starting to trust again. People are seeing that we are acting." Mendez nodded, his face grave but with a gleam of unshakable determination. He knew that each arrest was a painful blow to the institution's image, but it was a necessary evil. The surgery was brutal, but essential to save the patient. "It's a painful process, Helena, but we cannot retreat. With every corrupt individual we remove, we are planting a seed of integrity. We need to show the country that the federal police is, and always will be, a bastion of justice, not a haven for uniformed criminals." The media, once focused on the scandal, now began to report on the institution's courage in self-cleansing. Headlines shifted from "federal scandal" to "federal police initiates unprecedented cleanup." Trust, shaken by years of disillusionment, began to be rebuilt, brick by brick. New oversight protocols, anonymous and protected reporting channels, rigorous ethical training, everything was being implemented with urgency. The message was clear. The era of impunity had ended. The uniform, once a shield for abuse, would now be a symbol of responsibility and service. The promise of a new dawn was not just a metaphor. It was a reality being forged with sweat, tears, and the firm conviction that honor and duty should prevail. The path was long and the challenges immense, but Mendez's determination to restore the soul of the federal police was unshakable. He was building a legacy, not for himself, but for future generations of police officers who would swear to protect and serve with integrity. Almeida's downfall, a man consumed by the darkness of his own errors, paradoxically, had ignited the flame for a new era of light and justice within the institution he tried to corrupt. As Almeida fell into his private abyss, the federal police, purified by the fire of truth, began to rise again, stronger and more integral than ever. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, a dry final sound that sealed Almeida's fate. "Guilty." The word resonated, repeated 25 times, one for each crime, each ruined life. The cumulative sentence was an insurmountable mountain of years, a life sentence disguised as imprisonment. Almeida didn't react. His body, once muscular and imposing, seemed to have shrunk under the weight of the conviction. His eyes, once full of arrogance, were now empty, fixed on a distant point, as if already gazing into the abyss that awaited him. Dr. Ricardo, by his side, merely squeezed his shoulder, a gesture of compassion that seemed out of place given the magnitude of the fall. There were no more arguments, no appeals. Justice, slow and relentless, had arrived. In the cell, silence was his new executioner. The cold, damp walls were a mirror of his soul. The images of Anna and the children, once a torment, were now a silent torture. He had promised to protect them, but had condemned them to a life of shame and scorn. Poverty, which he so feared, seemed a distant paradise compared to the moral misery he had imposed upon them. The name Almeida, once synonymous with authority, was now a stigma, an indelible stain that would follow them forever. He had destroyed not only his own life, but the future of his family, with a brutal efficiency that not even his worst enemies could have achieved. As Almeida drowned in his personal hell, the outside world, driven by Director General Mendes's unshakable determination, continued its march toward redemption. The Pandora's box had been emptied, and what remained was the opportunity to rebuild. The Internal Affairs and Federal Police Task Force, under Dr. Helena's tireless leadership, had become a symbol of hope. Arrests didn't stop with Almeida. They extended through all ranks, revealing a web of corruption that shocked the nation, but which, at the same time, purified the institution. Director, the latest Internal Affairs report is encouraging, Dr. Helena reported to Mendes. Her eyes, though still tired, gleamed with a new purpose. Anonymous complaints have increased by 300% in the last 6 months, and the resolution rate for these complaints is 85%. New internal communication channels are working, and the see no evil, speak no evil culture is being dismantled. Mendes listened, a discreet smile appearing on his grave face. The pain of the surgery had been immense, but the results were visible. The federal police, once viewed with distrust, was slowly regaining its place of honor. New oversight protocols, intensive ethical training, and a zero-tolerance policy for corruption were transforming the institution from within. With each corrupt individual removed, a seed of integrity was planted, and the soil, once barren, began to flourish. The media, which once ravenously exploited the scandal, now celebrated the federal police's courage in self-cleansing. Headlines, once grim, now spoke of renewal at the federal police, justice restored, and Mendes's legacy, a stronger institution. Public trust, shaken by years of disillusionment, was being rebuilt, brick by brick, with every transparent action, every integral officer who emerged from the shadows. Mendes knew the path was still long. Vigilance was constant, and the temptation of corruption, a beast that never slept. But he had planted the seeds of a new era, an era where the uniform would be a symbol of responsibility and service, not a shield for abuse. He had forged a legacy, not for himself, but for future generations of police officers who would swear to protect and serve with integrity, honoring the oath Almeida had profaned. In his office, Mendes looked out at the city through the window. Lights twinkling in the darkness. Almeida's downfall, a man consumed by the darkness of his own errors, paradoxically, had ignited the flame for a new era of light and justice within the institution he tried to corrupt. The federal police, purified by the fire of truth, was rising again, stronger, more integral, and more resilient than ever. Far away in the cold cell, Almeida was just a shadow, an echo of a shattered life. Silence was his eternal companion, and darkness his only reality. For him, there was no light at the end of the tunnel, only the certainty of severe punishment, a life behind bars, where his only solace would be the incessant echo of his own mistakes. But for the institution he stained, dawn had arrived. The sun was rising, promising a new day, guided by the determination of men and women who believed that honor and duty should and would prevail. The cycle was complete. Justice had been served.